Learning for Collective Action series. This is session 5 of our Dyslexia series. Today we are discussing using Acadience Learning Online to identify readers at risk for dyslexia. A special thanks to the Skillman Foundation for making this series possible. My name is Elise Hartman, and I am facilitating. I am an urban educator with a literacy background and more than a decade of experience teaching in the public school system, leading youth-based programs for nonprofit organizations, and working in social service settings for community development corporations. I am the Director of Collective Learning and Resources at 313 Reads. 313 Reads is a collective impact coalition dedicated to increasing access to literacy support for young children in Detroit with the goal of every child reading at grade level by grade 3. This is a 5-part series with an overall goal to increase knowledge of and access to what dyslexia is, what is the larger state level policy initiative around dyslexia, and what are some evidence-based practices in working with students with dyslexia. Our Learning for Collective Action series is part of a larger coalition building around literacy policy for equity. If you haven't already done so, please remember to register for your chance to win a copy of Black, Brilliant, and Dyslexic. The winner will be notified by email immediately following today's discussion. So please go to tinyurl.com/313reads dyslexia 5 and register. At the end of our discussion, we will have a Q&A, and also please feel free to ask questions along the way by leaving a comment as we live stream today on Facebook. I'd like to introduce you to today's panelist. Roland H. Good III, PhD, is co-chair, board of directors of Acadience Learning Inc. and co-author of Acadience Reading K-6, also published under the name Dibbles Next, as well as earlier versions of the Dibbles Assessment. Dr. Good completed his undergraduate degree in elementary and special education, and he has 2 years' experience as a teacher in elementary general education and special education classrooms. He earned his doctorate from Pennsylvania State University in school psychology and served 2 years as a school psychologist. For the past 30 years, Dr. Good has led the program of research and development culminating in the Acadience Reading Measures. Dr. Good has provided professional development regarding the use of these measures to educators and administrators throughout the United States. He has also served on the editorial boards of School Psychology Review, School Psychology Quarterly, and the Journal of Special Education. And he has presented more than 100 papers at national conferences. In 2005, Penn State awarded Dr. Good its Excellence in Education Award in recognition of his contributions to the field of education. Resha Conroy brings over a decade of experience in charter school administration and nonprofit management. She has served on school leadership teams and as a consultant for charter schools in Washington, D.C. and New York City. Currently, Resha is a speech-language pathologist with an interest in language, literacy, and culture. She has an MS in communicative sciences and disorders and an MPA in nonprofit management from New York University. A mother of 2 children with learning differences, including a son with dyslexia, Resha is motivated by her family's journey and a lifelong passion for education reform to bring awareness to the intersectionality of race and literacy. Niki Beebani currently works at Detroit Institute for Children as the Director of Program Development and Quality, bringing 10+ years of experience helping schools and nonprofits strengthen their programs and increase their impact with children and families. With an extensive research background involving data collection, analysis, and presentation, she has served in a number of key roles planning and evaluating programs with such leading human service agencies as Girl Scouts of Southeastern Michigan and the Guidance Center. Niki received her BSW from Wayne State University and her MSW from the University of Michigan and is a licensed macro social worker, a geographic information systems professional. Altogether, her work provides DIC with both quantitative and qualitative data that objectively informs effective and impactful program design and implementation. We have a framing question for you today. As you're listening to the discussants, please think about, how is access to dyslexia identification a social justice issue? The first portion of our discussion, we're going to be talking about dyslexia identification and unequal access with Resha Conroy.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Resha Conroy, and I am the founder of the Dyslexia Alliance for Black Children. Thank you so much for having me here today. So to start off with, we're going to go through a series of questions. I'll read the question and then give you an overview or a response to the question. So the first one, what are some of the key characteristics of dyslexia, and do they present differently in Black and Brown students? So I want to start off by talking about reading, right? So reading and our brain is not wired for reading. So we have areas of the brain that are responsible for various functions. So we know that there are certain parts of the brain that are responsible for oral language. There are certain parts of the brain that are responsible for vision and for hearing. But reading is a process that doesn't sit in any one area of the brain. Instead, it relies on distributed areas, and it relies on the connections between these areas in order to read. And so because our brain is not wired for reading, we actually have to build these pathways. And we can build these pathways, and we know this because we now have MRIs and where we can look at the brain. We can build these pathways through evidence-based reading instruction. So there's some people who are able to build these pathways very easily, and there are individuals who require a lot of intensive instruction to build these pathways. So it starts off with a continuum, right? And at the end of that continuum, where you require more intensive instruction, those are going to be a lot of our students who have dyslexia. So dyslexia is neurobiological in origin, meaning that it's brain-based. And the difficulties that we see are going to be with word recognition, decoding, so connecting letters to sounds and sounding out words, so those things that you see in the classroom, and spelling. And it also has to do with the way that we process the sound structure of language, so phonological processing. Dyslexia is the most common learning disability, so occurring in about 5 to 20% of the population. 20% is the high end that we see in the research, but 5 to 20%. And it's really important to note that it's independent of intelligence. So you can be, a highly intelligent person and be unable to read because you have dyslexia. And it occurs across all genders, ethnicities, languages, and socioeconomic status. So if you are someone who speaks multiple languages, those characteristics of dyslexia are going to occur across those languages. They may occur in different ways because of the structure of the language, but it is going to occur. So what dyslexia is not, and it's important to understand this because very often this is what kind of shows up, right? So dyslexia is not a child being lazy. It's not a child who's not trying hard enough. It's actually not the result of poor reading instruction. Remember that it's brain-based. But you do have students who might look like they have dyslexia because they haven't had exposure to evidence-based reading practices. And we call these children curriculum casualties. It's not a term that I coined, but certainly one that helps us to understand what happens for those students. And it's not a vision disorder, right? Sometimes you'll hear about vision treatment and therapies, and certainly things can co-occur, but it's phonological. So we're talking about the sounds of our language. And the way it's going to show up in children, and it's important to understand that it shows up even before you start to read, right? So if we're talking about the sound system of the language in really young children, so preschool age, it might be the way that they're pronouncing words or mispronouncing words. They may be really overwhelmed with language, or their language development might be delayed. You might see that they're having a hard time retrieving words, and we call that word finding difficulties, or following directions. So maybe they require a lot of repetition. When we start to do rhyming games with our preschoolers, you might see that they're not able to recognize rhyming words. And that's a really early sign that happens before they're even reading. When they get to school, then it starts to show up in their academics. So they're going to have trouble sounding out words. So that's the decoding. They're going to have trouble with spelling. So, what we call encoding. And, as they progress in school, they are going to, maybe need more time. You might start to see some differences in their ability to comprehend what they hear versus what they read. And then we have what I call sort of the secondary behaviors. And so some of those secondary behaviors are going to be things like the child doesn't like to read, or they avoid reading, or they avoid school. And it may also show up in their behaviors. So you may start to see them acting out, or what appears like they're acting out, or it might be more internalized. So it might be impacting their self-esteem. They might have anxiety. They might, be dealing with depression. So lots of things can happen. So based on research, we know that dyslexia occurs, like I said, across all races and ethnic groups. So there's not really a difference in how it's going to present in Black and Brown students. The difference that we're seeing is really how we interpret the signs and the symptoms of dyslexia, both those sort of primary and secondary symptoms. And there's a higher likelihood of not seeing the language and the academic components for Black children, but seeing the secondary behaviors. And then addressing those secondary behaviors, typically in a way that is very punitive, or by misdiagnosing a child whose primary diagnosis might be dyslexia, but you're seeing those secondary behaviors. So you diagnose them with a behavior, or you give them a behavioral classification, very often not addressing the root causes. Okay, next slide, please. So why do we need the term at-risk reader? So there are lots of ways that we can frame this, right? It could be a student who is at risk for reading difficulties, or they have the high potential for reading difficulties. But what we need is to be aware of the signs and symptoms of language-based reading disorders like dyslexia. And if we're aware of them, then we can create a system and we can cast a wide enough net so that we can prevent children from falling between the cracks. And this commitment really starts with having evidence-based reading practices in the classroom. So what we know of as structured literacy at tier 1, right? So in the general education classroom. And once we have this, we're allowing for every child to have access to what we know works. And what's going to vary is going to be the dose that we give a child. So how much instruction do they need, and the intensity. What we know is that most students, so students who have dyslexia, students who don't have dyslexia, students who are striving to read, most students require evidence-based reading instruction to learn to read. And the research says it's about 60% of students. So most of the students sitting in your classroom. Again, the difference is going to be in the intensity. But when we don't have evidence-based reading instruction in the general education classroom, which is often the case, it's going to become more difficult for us to figure out who has dyslexia. So you're not going to be able to tell who is a curriculum casualty and who has a neurologically based reading disorder. So as we sort of frame all of this, one of the big takeaways when we talk about risk, being at risk or not being at risk, is that whether you are or not, most students can learn to read. And the research tells us it's 95% of students can be taught to read using structured literacy. Now that other 5% might require additional intervention. So typically if there's really severe deficits in language or working memory, then you bring in some of your other specialists. But 95% of students just with structured literacy can learn to read. And so when we have structured literacy and universal screeners and good benchmark assessments, then we are doing the work that's critical to make sure that we are catching those students who might be at risk. So what are the short and long-term impacts of undiagnosed dyslexia? So we have heard, and nowadays we're hearing a lot, that literacy is the great equalizer. And I think of it as contributing to sort of leveling the playing field, but I really think of it as a protective factor. And protective factors are those things that are going to promote our well-being and that are going to reduce the risk of negative outcomes. And so one example of a protective factor that easily comes to mind is wealth, right? So if you have money, you have a cushion against a lot of the adversities of life. But literacy also provides students with some protection from adverse life outcomes. And we know this because we see it in the numbers. So unfortunately, children who are not reading by fourth grade are more likely to struggle in school and more likely to eventually drop out. So they don't have that protection of literacy. When we look at some of the most severe outcomes, so we look at our homeless population, there's a study that shows that more than half of our homeless population has symptoms of learning disabilities like dyslexia. So, again, not having access to those protective factors. And then there are a couple of studies of prison inmates that has shown us that more than 80% of prison inmates are functionally illiterate, and that of that 80%, 47.8% of them have word attack skills that are consistent with the dyslexia diagnosis. So once again, more negative outcomes for individuals who don't have the protective factor of literacy. And our students with dyslexia are going to experience this more than our students who don't have dyslexia. On the other end of things, and the other way that we know that literacy is protective is, again, when we go back to our prison population, adults who are incarcerated who have access to an educational and participate in an educational program, including literacy instruction, are less likely to return to prison. So 43% less likely to return to prison. So when we infuse this in the prison population, we give them a protective factor. And so this protective factor is the same thing that we need to infuse into early elementary school. The last study that I came across, it's out of the University of Minnesota, and it was actually a study that was not about literacy. It was about protective factors and resilience. And so they looked at a population of homeless families. And so most of them were living below the poverty level. And what they found was, although they were without a home, although they were living below the poverty level, if they were reading by first grade, they had significantly better outcomes. So once again, literacy is protective. And if we can infuse this early on in a child's academic career, we reduce the risk of those negative outcomes for them. So again, speaking about those sort of secondary behaviors, I talked a lot about it's showing up in the prison population. And so we talk about the school to prison pipeline. And more specifically in this sort of space, we talk about the dyslexia to prison pipeline. So seeing the students who are failing to identify showing up, in the prison, in our prison population. And for Black students with or without learning disabilities, with or without dyslexia, we know that they're also experiencing discipline practices and policies that are biased. They're experiencing lower expectations for them as a learner. And so the impact is negatively compounded for them. Okay, next. So why is access important? So universal access to structured literacy, so giving students something that we know works, infusing literacy into our early elementary school practices is going to reduce the likelihood of negative outcomes. And this becomes critical for students who are already facing the sort of intersection of race and literacy. And it's one way for us to begin to address systemic barriers. And systemic barriers are weaved throughout our system. And the earlier that we can act, the better the outcomes for our students. So when I talked about dyslexia being neurobiological in nature and being able to connect or to create those pathways in the brain, you want to do that when there's a lot of neuroplasticity or the brain is young, and so it's easier to connect to make those pathways. When we do this, when we take on as schools, when we take on the responsibility of instruction, then we also do something really important. We remove assumptions about school readiness. if we start off with expectations that every child can learn to read, and we provide them with what they need to learn to read, then we don't have to talk about, well, they didn't have enough books at home, or they weren't exposed to enough of whatever those measures are that we're putting there, that really places blame on families and students, and very often doesn't respect or acknowledge the assets that a child might bring into the classroom. When I was approaching this issue, of course, I looked at the social identity of students, and so, being Black or having a different linguistic background, or having a lower socioeconomic status, but also looked at the historical components. And so when we think about literacy, we also have to remember that literacy is something that has been denied across hundreds of years to Black communities. And it started with anti-literacy laws. And so access being denied. So when we talk about why is access important, it's historically been denied. And the battle continues to have access to education and to have access to literacy. And it's coming about in new forms. So from anti-literacy laws to Jim Crow, to segregation, to mass incarceration, to the inequitable distribution of educational resources across the country and within communities, to biased disciplinary practices, so removing students from the classroom because they're presenting with behaviors that might be secondary to reading difficulties, to structured literacy deserts, which we see across the country today, where we have geographic locations where we don't have teachers or interventionists who are trained in delivering evidence-based practices. And those are very often predictable by zip code, predictable by the demographics of a community. And we have the reading wars. So we are still debating whether or not we should teach children the code of the language, whether or not we should teach them to decode and encode so that they have true access to literacy. Next slide, please.
Yes, I think that is the final slide. Please continue. Did you have something else that you wanted to?
Yes.
I think that was.
Yep. So I think there was one more question. Oh, sorry, it's there. How are systemic inequities preventing Black and brown children from being identified and receiving support? So there's not a lot of information about how underdiagnosed or misdiagnosed Black and brown students are. But we do have some studies that have come about. So we often talk about dyslexia, and we talk about this sort of wait to fail model for students. For Black and brown students, we have a let them fail model, right? We don't intervene. And there are many reasons why we don't intervene. The first reason has to do with the construction of our educational system and the residual sort of effects of systemic racism, including, and one of the most pronounced is implicit bias, right? And so most of us know what implicit bias is. It's our subconscious thoughts around, how we perceive an individual. And the issue with implicit bias, specifically for dyslexia, is that dyslexia is defined as unexpected, right? So when you see a child not learning to read, it should raise a flag. You should say, well, I expect this child can learn to read. But very often for Black students, the expectation is not there. And so no alarms are going off, right? And so this happened to me with my son, where I was pretty much told that it's okay if he's not reading at grade level, or if his reading skills are on the low end of average. And we know this as well because when we look at the numbers and we see the NAEP scores for reading, we know that only 18% of Black fourth graders are reading at or above grade level, but we're not sounding any alarms. So very often when we have a child who is not reading, and they're a Black child, and maybe they also have, speak a dialect, maybe they are have a lower socioeconomic status, we often call them poor readers. We don't give them the benefit of high expectations. And then you have a child, maybe they're non-Black peers. So let's say a white child who's also very privileged and maybe very wealthy, and they're given that dyslexia diagnosis, or there's this expectation that they can learn to read. And we ask, well, why aren't they learning to read? Let's dig deeper. And so that's one of the issues that we have. The other issue that we have is really in the law, right? So really in our special education law, and that it allows public schools a lot of wiggle room in how they interpret the law and how they identify students with dyslexia. So once you enter that sort of special education space, it really becomes, and the law is structured this way, it is up to families to hold schools accountable, right? So families who don't understand literacy, who don't understand dyslexia, who don't have access to professionals, because within if you're not an educator, and even some educators may not understand fully dyslexia, you may not have access to that information. So families who do have access, they can hire an advocate, they can hire an attorney to hold the school accountable. So that's one place that we start to see these these disparities again. And then when we look at the law again, when we look at IDEA, it actually has exclusionary language. So if a child has an emotional disturbance, and we talked about Black students being identified with those secondary behaviors. So a Black student in New York City, for example, is 2 times more likely to be identified with an emotional disturbance. And so once they get that primary diagnosis, they can exclude them from getting a specific learning disability classification like dyslexia, and therefore never treating the root cause. Again, in IDEA, it also, you can be excluded if someone deems that your cultural background is what's causing the difficulty. So your linguistic background, if you speak a second language, or if you speak use a different dialect. And then economic disadvantage can also exclude you from the diagnosis. So there are many ways that we are not providing access to Black and Brown children who need access to evidence-based reading instruction and access to assessment and intervention. And thank you.
Resha, thank you. Thank you so much for the important work that you're doing at the Dyslexia Alliance for Black children, for advocating, and for, as you said, sounding the alarm when it comes to the discrepancies in expectation. And also for holding the schools and educators and policymakers accountable. Thank you. Thank you for
You're
the work
welcome.
that you're doing.
Thank you.
And Dr. Good, Risha was talking about in assessments and the importance of the assessments. And we'd like to welcome you to the stage to talk about Acadience reading and at-risk identification. Dr. Good.
Hello, and boy, thank you for allowing me to be a part of this. I'm just so pleased and honored to join you. And I was sitting here cheering as Risha was talking about all of the points that she made. I think they're just right on, and she's going to be a really hard act for me to follow. But I wanted to talk about Acadience reading and sort of how we would use data to look at children who are at risk for dyslexia, and also how we can use that assessment as a part of our prevention and early intervention to improve outcomes for those students. So next slide. And I'm starting really with the definition here of dyslexia, not because I want to spend time on it. I just want to note, like Risha did, that this is really about word reading and decoding, particularly around the phonological component of language, hearing, understanding the sounds, and matching those sounds to letters, regrouping those to form a word. Next slide. There are key things that we're going to look for. And in that dyslexia, I'm sort of taking the ideas of the definition and saying, what can I measure from my assessment that will get at those big ideas? And I would identify 3 indicators, and I call these definitive indicators. These are the things that are the most important around dyslexia screening. The fundamental one is difficulty with essential early literacy and reading skills, especially measures of accurate and fluent reading, word reading and decoding, and especially phonological processing, including phonemic awareness and phonics. But that's not enough. In addition to difficulty with those skills, we're looking for real difficulty in learning those skills. Students have to be taught these skills, as was noted, but some have more difficulty than others. And so I'm looking for a sustained lack of adequate progress, even when we're providing that instruction. And the third thing we're looking for, and I think all three of these are critical, is evidence that the child is being provided with generally effective instruction. As we've noted, there are reading wars, there's argument about how this should be read. Should we teach the essential early literacy and reading skills? Should we not? These are not natural. We need to teach them. Unfortunately, we cannot assume that every school is doing that. So we need to include evidence about the effectiveness of instruction as well. Next slide. I include other indicators, and I'm not going to talk much about them today other than to acknowledge them. Difficulty with rapid automatized naming, or RAN, spelling, or family history of reading difficulty. I think the really definitive ones are around the difficulty learning to read that the definitive indicators target. Next slide. These essential early literacy and reading skills, and I have named them on the left, include phonemic awareness, the alphabetic principle and basic phonics, advanced phonics and word attack skills, accurate and fluent reading of connected text, reading comprehension. Now, different people will use somewhat different wording around each of those, but there is broad agreement about how essential these early literacy skills are. I would stress that these are skills. Each of these is a teachable skill. We know how to teach these skills. We know how to measure those skills. Acadience reading, and here is the Acadience reading K through 6, has a set of measures that target those skills. So I can look at phoneme segmentation fluency or nonsense word fluency to target the first two skills, for example. I can measure each one of these, and each of these assessments is a brief, repeatable assessment. And I'm going to show you why it's so important for them to be brief and repeatable. Next slide, please. So when I'm looking at this, here, this is number one, and I'm unpacking the three definitive indicators. This is number one, difficulty with the essential early literacy and reading skill. So here they are named briefly, and then I'm looking for, does the child have severe difficulty or some difficulty in that particular area? With Acadience reading, I can target some difficulty. We call that below benchmark. These are kids who are likely to need strategic support. I can quickly identify severe difficulty. This would be well below benchmark or likely to need intensive support. And the question is, can we clarify Acadience reading K6 can serve as a screener, but not as a diagnostic tool? And I would argue that Acadience reading K6 is a critical screener, but it's also a critical part of diagnosis. I'm not saying it is a diagnostic tool or all of diagnosis, but I would argue it's a critical part, because I'm going to go to the second part that we're going to, well, let me build it step by step. So first is difficulty, and next slide. So I can look at a report. This is for Edwards grade 1 classroom. Here are two students. Here at 19 and 9 is Otis and Evelyn. And Evelyn had a 16 and a 15 on PSF and NWF, and they're targeted right away as having severe difficulty with those phonological awareness and alphabetic principle skills. So very quickly, I can go through that step one. Step two, and next slide, please. So second, it's not just low skills. It is a sustained lack of adequate progress when we're providing instruction on those skills. And so I'm going to look at the same essential early literacy and reading skills, and I'm going to be looking for a severe lack of adequate progress or some evidence of lack of adequate progress. And again, I'll talk about some as below typical progress. I can talk about severe as well below typical progress. We need a way to look at a student's learning over time in order to make this judgment. Next slide. In Acadience reading, and I'm zoomed in here on nonsense word fluency, and I'm looking at Evelyn, and she had an initial score of 15. And this is her first grade year. And if you look at the back, I can see a sort of a line there that indicates where she should be in order to be making adequate progress as a reader. This is our benchmarks that we're looking for. I can also evaluate progress, and these are the pathways of progress that would apply for Evelyn. And I can describe her progress or her rate of growth as being well above typical in the blue, above typical in the dark green, typical in the light green, below typical in yellow, and well below typical in red. So this is not just where she is, but it is how she is progressing. So next slide, please. I can set a goal for Evelyn. And here's my goal in the sort of target with 62 above it. And that's where I want her to get to with my instruction by the end of the year. If I can bring her from well below benchmark to at benchmark by the end of the year, I've changed the prediction of the future for Evelyn. That's the whole point. What can we do to improve outcomes for our students? So connecting the two is an aim line. Next slide, please. Now, in this slide, I'm showing, like this is through September and November, and a bit into December. And I'm looking at Evelyn's progress while we are teaching her. Each of these dots is about a brief 1-minute assessment. So I can see it's not working. And each of these vertical lines means I am trying as an instructor to do something about that. So here I've said I put her into an intervention group. She's still making well below typical progress. Here I've increased the dosage. Some of these students will really struggle to learn these skills. For some, it's easy to learn. For some, we need to, my hero, Anita Archer, would say we do it as I do, we do, you do. And some of these students will take a whole lot of I do, we do, before they learn the skill. But this skill is a teachable and learnable skill. But we have not found the level of support that Evelyn needs yet. So here I increased the dosage again. And each vertical line is a systematic attempt to increase the dosage and the intensity of support. And you can see going through 4 levels of intervention. This one was phonics for reading 20 minutes, for 2 days a week. Here I went to phonics for reading 20 minutes 4 days a week. Here I went to 40 minutes 4 days a week. Here I added additional practice. Now, these are all pretty good things to be doing, but for Evelyn, we have not yet found what it takes for her to be learning it. So this is what I would call a severe lack of adequate progress, even when we're trying to adapt instruction to meet her needs. Next slide, please. But those two are not enough. Showing that a student has very low skills, like Evelyn, showing that she is not making adequate progress. And notice how we could do that early. I didn't have to wait till the end of the year. I was doing something about it right away. Even those two things are not enough to be an indicator that the student is at risk for dyslexia. We also need to look at evidence that the school is providing generally effective instruction. And I would really talk about this sort of at a school level, at a grade level, at a classroom level, at the specific intervention group level. And we need a way to look at the effectiveness of the instruction that is being provided. We cannot only assume that good teaching is occurring. In many places it is. In many places it is not. So we have to examine the effectiveness of the instruction that is being provided. If we don't look at the instruction, I'm not sure if this is dyslexia or if this is a student who has just not been taught well, not been taught effectively, has not had an opportunity to learn. So I need to show that as well. Next slide, please. So in looking at this, in Acadience reading, we have what we call the effectiveness of instructional support report. And this is looking at how students did from the beginning of year to the middle of year in terms of their reading composite score. There are 4 panels showing how 4 groups of students performed. On the left are students who were well below benchmark, like Evelyn, at the beginning of the year. There were 22 of them. 80% of them were moving from the red zone to meeting the benchmark and even being above benchmark in the blue. Meeting the benchmark would be green, blue would be above benchmark. 80% of those students, like Evelyn, moved out of that intensive group. I'm going to focus on that well below benchmark group. But I want to note how important the other groups are as well. Below benchmark are those students who were at some risk and likely to need some support. At benchmark are the kids in the core who are on track. And we need evidence that's showing that what we are doing for the core is working and teaching these essential skills as well. Next slide, please. I also showed you the pathways of progress. And the pathways of progress, I showed you how Evelyn was stuck in that well below, in that red pathway. And here in my left panel, I'm looking at the 22 students who started with the same level of skills as Evelyn. And look, our intervention in this school had most of those students, over 80%, were making typical progress in the light green, above typical progress, or blue. So Evelyn is in a school where the intervention is being provided in a powerful and effective way for most students. But Evelyn is unusual in that she is not making adequate progress, even when we can show that she's in a context with generally effective instruction. Next slide. So the whole purpose of this is early screening. And I was looking at Evelyn at the very beginning of first grade, where difficulty reading is not necessarily dyslexia, but with an eye toward doing something about it. Prevention and early intervention. What do? Explicit teaching focused on those early literacy and reading skills. Targeted intensive intervention. Professional development on what to teach and how to teach it, individual student learning goals, and modification of instruction. Next slide, please. What do we need to keep in mind regarding this data, the identification and its overall accuracy, and what concrete steps should we take? Next slide. So really, all of this is a way of talking about database decisions, making decisions about what Evelyn needs and her progress and whether or not she needs modification of instruction is all database decision making. It's critical that we use standardized procedures so we know what it is she needs and what we need to do to modify support. We train Acadience mentors to support the school in making those outcomes. The whole purpose of assessment is to improve outcomes for students. So we need a database decision-making model that links the data to the decision to the outcome. And we recommend an outcomes-driven model that includes benchmark assessment and progress monitoring and formative evaluation. And next slide, please. So, concrete steps and takeaways. Screening is essential for students who are at risk of dyslexia, and universal screening in particular, but it should be focused first on prevention. What can we do to prevent reading difficulty later? And on early intervention. Only third, for older students with existing difficulties, do we shift to remediation. But prevention, early intervention comes first. A whole focus of this discussion has been to assess things we can teach, the things we can do something about, and then to do something about them. These are skills that can be taught, that students can learn. Third, it's not enough to evaluate the student. We must evaluate the instruction that is being provided. Thank you so much for the opportunity to join you today.
Thank you so much, Dr. Good. Thank you for such a thorough overview of Acadience. And we do have partners that use Acadience as an assessment tool to help improve literacy outcomes. And I'd like to invite Niki to actually share a little bit about how she's using it at Detroit Institute for Children to set goals and for growth and for benchmarks. Niki?
Hi, thank you so much for having me. Wow, to go after Dr. Good, I feel like he covered all my slides. But prior to using Acadience, we used pre-post data. We would use interventions, all with good intentions, right? But we didn't know if it actually worked. Now we have a baseline of where the student is at. It becomes much more than this student doesn't know how to read. Instead, it's the student is having difficulty with first sound fluency or letter recognition. So collecting student data at multiple points and inputting information regularly into Acadience helps us be more responsive and responsible to the needs of the student. Next slide. So what gaps and opportunities have you identified as a result of analyzing the data collected? Wow, a lot, let's just say. So current reliable data is the engine of our programs. It's so, so important. The data has allowed us to pinpoint exactly where the student is at, exactly. And like I said previously, it was, oh, the student doesn't know how to read, so, let's try whatever. It also allows us to chart the progress of our efforts, able to recognize problems and possible remedies. It also helps support the best allocation of resources that we provide to the students. The data also identified staff that need training to help the students, specifically with those interventions. Next slide. Oh, that's it. How is the data informing how you collaborate with parents, caregivers for better literacy outcomes? So Acadience is great because it provides parent reports on their child's data. However, we recognize providing the report wasn't enough, just giving it to them wasn't helpful. So we realized it gave us the opportunity to not only engage with a parent, but collaborate. So they have a knowledge of what the data means. It's also allowing us to develop relationships with the schools and teachers by sharing attendance and the assessment results, so that we're all on the same page with the students. So we're not duplicating interventions, where we're working together to make sure this student is meeting those benchmarks. But yeah, Acadience has been great. We began using it in the fall, in October. They did the pre-assessments, and we're just continuing to use it for the progress monitoring, and are excited to see at the end of the school year where we're going to be at.
And you're using it specifically as an assessment tool, is that correct?
Correct.
Is there any additional information that you'd like to share about your program and your students? And specifically, do you have any students that might have some dyslexia challenges? Anything that you've been able to identify using Acadience?
So we serve kids K through 12 with special needs. So that ranges from kids that need speech therapy all the way to kids who are autistic. And so also Acadience has really helped us to identify those that need extra speech or OT with their writing, where I don't know if we would have been able to do that. So again, it's, helping them with their reading, but in a need to, have that additional support as well. And so we have identified kids that have come in, a second grader that doesn't know how to read at all. And it's really sad knowing that. But again, we're hopeful that now we have this information to really, really, love this kid and provide everything that we can to get him where he's at.
And to advocate for them.
Exactly. And to get everybody on board, the parents, and even to provide the parents extra tools and resources for them to take home, to outside of us, outside of school, but in their home, ways that they can help so that it's meaningful to the parents. And it's not just worksheets and, here, have them read, but it's so specific. And like I said, it's great because it just really pinpoints what the students need to work on.
And going back to what Resha said, it's a way of sounding the alarm. And I
Yeah.
think that's so important. I love that she used that sounding the alarm and advocating, and also it identifies those discrepancies in expectations. And I really love the way that she framed that. So I keep repeating it. But what I would love to do is to invite Resha and Dr. Good to join you there, and really share any takeaways that you might have from this conversation, anything that you would like to add, or even just in your own from your own viewpoint, just talking to our providers about how they can, as Risha again said, advocate and sound the alarm for their students, and Dr. Good, how Acadience can help identify and be used as an assessment tool to identify dyslexia, and maybe even providing Niki with some things that she can go back to her organization with and use. And following this conversation, we'll have a Q&A where we would love our viewers to ask any questions that they might have of Niki and Dr. Good and Risha.
Okay, great. So I can start. So a couple of takeaways, and so much, of what I heard from across the presentations really resonated. But I think one thing that really stood out to me was something that Dr. Good said about having these outcome-driven models, right? So you're collecting really good data. What are you doing with it? And as you sort of develop these outcome-driven models, you want to make sure that they're bias-proof, right? We know how implicit bias plays into the way that we look at data and how we act on it. And so we want to make sure that there's equity in our implementation and equity in our action. And that's really important for our schools and for our decision makers. For parents, the big takeaway is really to trust your gut. If you see something happening with your child and you have questions, bring them to the school and ask for the data, right? So when my son was having difficulties with acquiring reading, the school had these benchmark assessments. They didn't share them with me. When I saw them, I said, it's right here in front of us. Here's the difficulties. It's showing up. We see exactly where it is, but they weren't using the information and they weren't sharing it with me in a way that would allow me to advocate for my child. So ask for it, and then ask them, well, how are you using it?
Mm-hmm. And to go off what you said, for us as well, the parents come in and said, we think they have a problem. And so even us giving them the Acadience reports, now they are equipped then to go to the schools and say, hey, look, we have evidence, we have proof that they're behind, so it really is just a great tool to, for us as, program providers and for the parents as well.
A couple of the comments were about just testing to test without using it. And really, this has been sort of our vision that we are dedicated to. We want to provide usable information to teachers that they can use and do something about it. We measure skills that can be taught. There are interventions that teach those skills. We want Acadience Reading to be the progress monitoring and formative evaluation tool that tells us, are we delivering those instruction and intervention and teaching in a way that's working for that student, or do we need to make a modification to it? I confess I'm a recovering school psychologist, and my initial training was how to admire problems, but that's very unsatisfying. I really want to target something the student needs, show where they could get to change the future for that student, and link that to instruction that will work for them. I think that the issues of implicit bias are are just huge, staggering, and heartbreaking. And I got to tell you, one of the things to look at is how is the whole school doing? The whole school, this is a school-wide systematic commitment to instruction, to teaching, to outcomes. And I think as educators, we should hold ourselves accountable. We should look at our school and we should ask, quite honestly, how are we doing in teaching these essential early literacy and reading skills? And if we're not where we want to be, then let's change what we're doing.
One of the things that sort of my motto at our program is that data, it powers good decision making. You know, that's what data does. That's what student data does. It powers us, empowers us to make good decisions.
And it's a good decision if it improves outcomes.
Mm-hmm.
So Resha, what is one thing that every parent could be doing? Just if you could say, hey, do this one thing, what would that one thing be?
What they could be doing with their child or in their interaction with the school?
Well, both, with their child and with the interaction with the school.
Mm-hmm. So, you know, it's going to depend on the family, what they can do. I think in the interaction with the school is to know, you know, what are the, you know, what's happening in the building. So getting access to the information that they have. Nowadays, we have a lot of report cards that come home that don't really tell you how your child is doing. So they may get a number or they may get a satisfactory, but it doesn't tell you if they're acquiring skills. And so, you know, having regular check-ins with the teacher is probably one of the best things that you can do in this age where we've you know, have the option to not just be in the building to check in. So you can do it by phone. You can, you know, do it virtually. You know, schedule those regular check-ins. Just put them into your calendar and ask the right questions. You know, how are we? You know, how's my child doing? Can you show me the data and how are we responding to that data? What you can do with your child at home is also check in with them, right? So you know, in schools, we will sometimes use these exit tickets. It's kind of a good place to start at home with your child. So what did you do in school today? What was the last thing you did in school before you packed up, right? So really having those conversations with your child to see what they're doing, and then you know, supplement as you can at home. So, you know, even if you're not, you know, well versed in reading instruction, which unless you're teaching, you've gotten those trainings, you haven't been, you can build oral language at home. That's a really significant way to help a child when it comes to some of those other skills that are required for reading comprehension. So if, you know, you reading to your child or giving them access to audiobooks or those types of things, just to build language.
And see, and those are all things that our partners can now say, here are some things that you can utilize at home, and they can share these things with the families. These are things that can be done at home. And then these are ways that you can advocate for your student in the school system. And Dr. Good, how, what is something that our partners can do? How can our partners take this information, interpret it, and utilize it for a better literacy outcome? Just if it was just one or two things that they did with Acadience Learning, what are those one or two things that they could do to improve that literacy outcome?
I would say the first of those things is to really focus on that set of essential early literacy and reading skills that I identified early on. Those are the critical pieces that make a difference between a reader and a non-reader. Then we need to take stock where we are as a school and look at what percent of our kids are at benchmark or above on each of those early literacy skills. If we're not getting most of them to the benchmark, we need to change what it is that we're doing. Those early literacy skills also become the critical piece of a conversation with parents. They may not understand alphabetic principle and basic phonics, but you can communicate with them. They need to know about letters making sounds and making words. And here are some examples that you can practice with this at home so that you're conveying the same and consistent message. It's those skills that make the difference between being a reader and a non-reader.
And Niki, I'm going to put you on the spot for just a second. So after having heard from Resha and from Dr. Good as a partner and as a provider, what is something that you now feel that you can take and go, you know what, we can implement this with as a provider, with our mentors, our tutors. They can use this when working with the students, and then we can turn around and share this particular thing with the families and the parents. Do you have anything that comes to mind?
I just what Resha had said, I think being, just more, specific in how we communicate to the parents and giving them, whether it's one or two examples of try this. I also think what Dr. Good had said, that it's just that progress monitoring, and if something's not working, we need to change it. It's not the student, it's us. So what do we need to do better? Because these are our measures, right? And we want to have great outcomes. We want to show that this is making an impact. So again, I think it's that changing what we need, our intervention, whatever it is, and then providing those examples and tidbits to those parents.
And I think, Resha, you had one final comment that you wanted to make as well.
Yeah, so I wanted to add just one more thing, because I talked a lot about or mentioned the secondary behaviors that we see. So, avoidance of reading, not liking to read, and then some of those behavioral things that will happen in the classroom. So, especially for parents who have older children, so older elementary school, middle school, when you get the call, because your first call might not be about academics, your first call might be about behavior. So when you get that call about behavior, what your child is not doing, they're being disruptive, they are tapping their neighbor every time there's read aloud, go back to the data, right? Okay, this is how my child is behaving. Show me how they're doing academically. Anytime you get a behavioral concern, show me the academic performance, because you might be connecting some dots there. The child might be behaving, their behavior might be telling you something about how they might be struggling academically. So that's just one really important takeaway, because that gets lost so much. And then the child gets blamed. They're not behaving, they're not, meeting classroom expectations. And that's not the issue very often.
And then they're focused on the wrong things. They're focused on the behavior instead of focus on teaching the skills that student needs.
Thank you so much. I would like to just open this conversation up to those that are watching now that might have some questions for us. So if there are any audience questions, please go ahead and just drop them in the comments for us. And you can either ask someone specifically, or if one of you feels as though this is a question for you, feel free to jump in. So you can just leave them in the comment section on Facebook. We will wait a few minutes here. Also, remember to go ahead and register to win a free copy of the book that we're giving away. You have a chance to win if you register for that at tinyurl.com/313 reads Dyslexia 5. It doesn't look like we have any questions right now. Oh. Mary Jo says, thank you. Really hope we can get the support our little humans need. Thank you, Ms. Mary Jo. I'd like to thank each of you for being here and for really engaging us in rich conversation, for our partners who are watching and who will see this later. We really appreciate you sharing your expertise. So thank you very much, Resha and Dr. Good and Niki for being here.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you for
you.
letting me be a part. What a great group. Thank you so much.
Yeah, it's been wonderful. And again, here's the URL for our book giveaway. And doesn't look like we have any additional questions. So thank you very much. We really appreciate it, and we might get some questions that come in later, and we will be forwarding those questions to you if you wouldn't mind asking or answering those questions for our partners. That would be fantastic, and we'll be forwarding your information to them as well, so that they can connect with you if they need to get in touch. But thank you so much for being a part of this, and we'd like to thank all of our audience members for tuning in, and we will be continuing to put out more of these learning series through 313 Read. So thank you everyone for your attendance, and thank you to our special discussants for being here. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.